Hi guys, welcome back. I appreciate you coming back. If you don't know, my name is Madeleine Klein and I talk about Canadian true crime and missing persons. Today's subject is quite the piece of work. Today I want to talk about Andrew Paul Johnson. I had never heard of this person until I learned about the case of Kenley Matheson. I posted about Kenley last week. I'll link that video below and we'll talk a little bit more about Kenley later. So when I learned that Andrew Paul Johnson was a suspect in the Kenley Matheson case, I also learned that he is a very, very terrible person who has a long criminal history dating back to the 80s for kidnapping and sexual assault. He is a diagnosed pedophile and had psychopathic tendencies, as well as substance abuse problems. I said to Jordan, the host of the Nighttime podcast, "Wow, I've never heard of this Andrew Paul Johnson before." And he replied, "Really? He's public enemy number one in Halifax." So who is Andrew Paul Johnson? Andrew Paul Johnson was born, I believe, in 1959, but I couldn't find an exact birth date. I'm actually quite surprised at how little information is available on his history or just him in general. I couldn't find when or where he was born or what his childhood may have looked like, and there are next to no photos of him. But what I do know is that his criminal record dates back to 1981 for violent crimes against women and children, both male and female. Andrew Johnson started his crimes in Halifax, Nova Scotia in the 80s, but the first recorded incident I could find information on was a 1993 incident where he tied up and sexually assaulted his ex-girlfriend by sodomizing her. In 1997, he masturbated in front of a group of young girls in front of an apartment building, which resulted in him getting sentenced to 3 years probation on January 27, 1997. His conditions would include no contact with women under 16. Why not all women? Why not everyone? He was to abstain from drugs or alcohol, and he was also sentenced to a treatment program for sexual offenders. During this time in treatment, he was asked to write an essay from the point of view of a sexual assault victim. What the psychiatrist received was a detailed account on the abduction, rape, and murder of Kimberly McAndrew, who vanished from a Canadian Tire parking lot in 1989. This essay was the reason authorities decided to search a property that belonged to Andrew Johnson's brother in March of 2013. Nothing was found in the search, and there was no evidence to convict him. At the end of September 1997, he fucks off from Halifax, breaching his parole in every way humanly possible, and drives to Nanaimo, British Columbia. That's over 5,000 kilometers and 59 hours of driving. Side note, I keep screwing up my distances. In the Kenley Matheson podcast, I mentioned that Cape Breton to Banff, Alberta is over 5,000 kilometers. And then in my Kenley Matheson video, I correct myself and say it's only 1,500 kilometers. But no, that was wrong. I was right the first time. East Coast to West Coast is like 5,000 kilometers. It's a long ass drive. Anyway, on October 6th, 1997, Andrew Paul Johnson is in Nanaimo, British Columbia, attempting to lure young girls into his car under the guise of a police officer. The first young girl was 12 years old. He spoke to her through his car window. He showed her a fake badge and told her that there had been some robberies in the area, and she was identified as a suspect. He asked her to get into the car, but she refused. So he took down her name and phone number and went on his way. A few hours later, in the early evening around 6 p.m., he approached another young girl who was also 12. He showed her his fake badge and used the same story on her. There was a robbery in the area, and did she know anything about it? And she was a suspect. He got her name and birthday and asked her to get into the car so they could talk, and also told her he wanted her to take a lie detector test. She refused, thank God, telling him that she would go get her mom. After she said that, he was like, "Oh no, don't worry about it," and drove away. After 2 failed attempts, his third try was successful. He spotted a young girl riding her bike, pulled over, and once more posed as a police officer. The thing about this victim is she was 20 years old, but she was intellectually challenged. She looked a lot younger than her actual age, and she was vulnerable. She believed he was a cop and got into the back seat. He took her to the outskirts of town, all while drinking heavily. At one point, she got upset and wanted to be taken back to her bicycle and started to panic when she tried to get out of the car, but the child locks were engaged. At 7 p.m., an RCMP officer stopped Andrew Johnson as his car matched a description of a car trying to pick up young girls earlier in the day. I imagine there aren't a ton of Nova Scotia plates in British Columbia. When the Mountie looked in the back seat and saw this young girl, he asked her who the driver of the vehicle was, and she replied with, "He's a cop, just like you." And the cop was like, "Really?" So Andrew Johnson was arrested on the scene for impersonation of a police officer, and he was also clearly intoxicated, 0.13 blood alcohol level. And when they searched his vehicle, all kinds of disturbing items were found. They found a broken police badge, fake but durable metal handcuffs, pornography, packing tape, KY lube, a Halloween mask, a map he had drawn with the names and phone numbers and addresses or whatever information he had gotten from the girls he tried to pick up previously. And last but not least, they found a meat cleaver under the passenger seat of his car. So in short, a sex offender on parole had a rape kit and a weapon, all while plastered with an abducted woman in his backseat. Andrew Paul Johnson is arrested, they look into his history, and they are horrified. He has been incarcerated since the 1997 arrest, and in 2001, he was officially declared a dangerous offender. I'm unsure why, but the title was dropped in 2005, and then 3 years later, in 2008, he was put back on the dangerous offenders list, and remains there to this day, on the list and in prison. He has been denied parole 10 times, the most recent being just a year and a half ago in June of 2021. See, although he has never been charged for murder, Andrew Paul Johnson is a suspect in many cold cases in Halifax from the 80s and 90s. As mentioned before, 19-year-old Kimberly McAndrew went missing August 12, 1989 from her workplace parking lot. She left her job at Canadian Tire just before 4:30 p.m. and was never seen again. Andrew Johnson coincidentally had a girlfriend who lived in close proximity to Canadian Tire. In fact, either her bedroom window or her patio faced the parking lot. Kim wasn't the adventurous, spontaneous type. In fact, she was the opposite. She wouldn't even go downtown alone. Her father was an RCMP officer, though, so she may have been quick to trust someone with a badge, even if they were in civilian clothing. It's believed Kim was abducted right from the Canadian Tire parking lot, and her remains have never been found. Just 2 days after Kimberly's disappearance, a woman named Leslie Ann Levy was found clinging to life with her throat slashed in Point Pleasant Park. She would survive this senseless attack only to overdose on her pain medication 6 months later. She was never able to talk to anybody about her attack, but I think it's worth noting that Leslie worked at a restaurant directly across the street from the Canadian Tire Kim worked. Now, there are a couple other suspects, persons of interest in Kimberly's case. One of them was Canadian serial killer Michael Wayne McGray, who's convicted of 7 murders, but boasts he's responsible for 18. When asked if he killed Kim McAndrew, he said something to the effect of, "The name rings a bell, but I can't say for sure if I did or not." The other suspect remains unnamed, but at the time of her disappearance, Kim had a man stalking her. This 30-year-old man worked in the area and was caught more than once lingering around Canadian Tire when Kim was working, and was also caught on multiple occasions taking photos of her. He was even at the store talking to Kim hours before she disappeared. He was interviewed multiple times and had no problem admitting that he had followed her home multiple times because he liked to feel close to her. 7 years later, they would search his home because they believed he may have killed her and may have kept souvenirs. They found numerous photos of Kim still up on his wall, as well as newspaper clippings and missing persons posters from her disappearance. They had found a book he had handwritten to Kim, sadistic pornography, as well as violent books. It's interesting to note that they also found newspaper clippings from 18-year-old Andrea King's disappearance. On January 1st, 1992, Andrea King flew from her home in New Westminster, British Columbia, to Halifax to travel around and work. She called home from the airport when she arrived in Halifax, told her family she'd be staying at a hostel, and would call them the next day, but she was never heard from again. Nearly a year later, on December 22nd, her remains were found in a wooded area in Lower Sackville, not far from the airport. This unnamed suspect drove past the wooded area she was found in every day to go to work. He was investigated and his house was searched, but there was no solid evidence found linking him to either woman's murder. I bring these two other suspects up because they all kind of bleed into each other. Unnamed guy was infatuated with Kim, but they found clippings from Andrea King's murder and placed his work route as close to where she was found. Michael Wayne McGray is not only linked to numerous other murders, but the attempted murder of Leslie Ann Levy bore a striking resemblance to his other killings, as well as Andrea King's murder fits his MO. A red shoe and makeup compact of Andrea's was found among Andrew Paul Johnson's possessions when they searched a storage locker of his. But we didn't have the forensics and DNA technology then to positively and confidently link Andrea and Johnson. By the time DNA was precise enough to provide answers, police had not only kind of lost interest in the case, but this vital evidence was lost. The connection between the three suspects in the Kimberly McAndrew case are striking, and it makes me wonder if perhaps these men had worked together at one point. Predators working together is not unheard of and probably more common than you think. If you haven't seen it, watch Have You Seen Andy on Crave. It's not a Canadian case. This happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts in the 1970s, but it's my favorite documentary. It's insane. And spoiler alert, you find out these pedophiles are all working together. It's a network. I wouldn't be surprised if these men all knew each other and helped one another at one point. Getting back to Andrew Paul Johnson. In late April 1996, 21-year-old Stephen Hall went missing while hitchhiking in Chester, Nova Scotia. His remains were found 7 months later in November. His case too remains cold, and Andrew Paul Johnson has been named a suspect. If you watched my last video about Kenley Matheson, you'll know that back in September of 1992, 20-year-old Kenley Matheson vanished from Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Just a week before his disappearance, it's alleged Andrew Paul Johnson had dinner at a house on Corcomb's Island where Kenley was staying with friends. This speculation has no rock-solid evidence placing Kenley and Andrew Johnson at the same location. And Andrew Paul Johnson maintains having no memory of ever meeting Kenley or ever being on Corcomb's Island, let alone having dinner at a house there. Andrew Paul Johnson maintains he has never met any of the victims mentioned and maintains he has had nothing to do with any of their disappearances or murders. He would go on to say that he is being made a person of interest in all of these Halifax cold cases as a strategy to keep him in jail. See, in Canada, a life sentence is 25 years, but if you're declared a dangerous offender, they can sentence you indeterminately. So they can keep you forever if they want, keep denying parole. It's almost like being found not guilty by reason of insanity. Many people are angered by this verdict, but those who receive a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict often spend more time committed than they would have had they been found guilty on first or second degree murder. I'm actually quite surprised and impressed with the BC justice system because here in Saskatchewan, I am always reading news bulletins stating they're releasing some sex offender who's high risk to reoffend. It's truly baffling. It says right in the article they're dangerous, and I'm like, so why are we letting them out? Anyway, I'm glad that day and full parole are not being considered at this time, but what is being considered is a gradual release plan. This means escorted temporary absence package, whatever the hell that means. Like, I understand the first three words, but like, what's this package all about? And this also means consideration to be transferred to a lower security facility. Like I said, this is only being considered. I don't know 100% if this plan is in action yet. Andrew Paul Johnson does eventually want to be paroled, live in a halfway house in BC, and make his way home to Nova Scotia. In Missing Kenley, Andrew Paul Johnson is interviewed for the first time in 20 years. He claims he knows what he did was wrong, but in my opinion, downplays what he did and what his intentions were. He said, I tried to lure young girls into my car and I can't do stuff like that. Like, yes, Andy, that's not good, but you're a rapist. Have we forgotten this part? He also tries to downplay the items that were found in his car. He claims he knows he's hurt people and deserves a prison sentence, but then ends that with saying he needs to move on. Move on from what? You're the one that ruined lives. My issue is you can't cure pedophilia and you can't cure psychopathy. You cannot trust a psychopath. So he can swear up and down he knows he's done wrong and that he's a changed man. How do you ever trust someone like that, who we know is capable of such brutal and horrific acts? There is not enough medication in the world. Please keep in mind, I actually have no credentials, and this is just my opinion. I'd love to talk to him, pick his brain, paw through his files and records. He applies for parole every 2 years, which is coming up this year in June. I wonder what, if anything, the future holds for Andrew Paul Johnson. I call him the Bernardo of Nova Scotia, and I think that's a pretty accurate description of him. As always, I'm going to link a few things down below. I'm going to link my episode about Kenley Matheson, as well as Jordan and I's podcast about him. And I will also have my link tree linked if you are moved to follow me on any social media or subscribe. I highly recommend subscribing so that you don't miss anything. As always, you can catch Jordan and I live from the Nighttime Podcast YouTube channel every Thursday night, and you can expect a post from me every Tuesday. But for now, I think that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will catch you guys later. Bye.